Thank you. Thank you. It's really tough to follow such distinguished panelists and some really excellent presentations. And, I kind of didn't know what to say when I was asked to talk here, and so I actually had once given a talk about what's hot in corporate finance and how that should influence your choice of research topics, and also sort of another topic that nobody's actually talked about, despite the fact that we have most of the editorial board of the RFS up in this room right now, is how the journal process works. So I think that's something that Andrew sort of touched on a little bit, is sort of how you can best deal with the journals is a very important thing that you have to learn if you want a career as an academic. So I will talk about both of these if I can. So the issue about sort of what topics are hot and why, and how does that affect your taking research topics, and again how the journal process works. So again, I guess it's sort of inevitable that a lot of what I'm going to say has been said already this morning. But what's our research about? What motivates it? Why do we do it? And I sort of think about research is falling basically into sort of two bundles, and some of it is sort of very fundamental, and it comes from thinking deeply about issues, and some of the more famous papers from Lane Miller, Black-Scholes, and every paper by Grossman Hart, and a lot of the papers Itai was talking about sort of would fall into that camp. And other research, and I think probably most finance research, and if you think about your own dissertations, probably most of it would fall into that category. They're really motivated by what's going on in the world, and so I think that one of the things I think is that much of what's sort of hot in finance is actually a function of what's happening in the real world, and that's, I think, a good thing about our profession, and not a bad thing. And I'm going to focus a bit on corporate finance, but I think much of what I'm saying is applicable to asset pricing, and especially financial institutions as well. So what I thought I'd do was to also define the beginning of the world, and so I defined the beginning of the world as when I started graduate school, which was 1983, and I actually, just out in the break, I met an old friend from graduate school, and we realized it was 30 years, and so it was kind of depressing for both of us. And so this is my biased view of what has been hot in corporate finance since 1983. And so, I'm sorry, the print is a little small, but in the mid-'80s there was a ton of takeover research. So the Jensen Weisbach thing came out, and there were all these advanced studies, and everyone was talking about the market for corporate control. And in the late 80s, and now this is sort of where my own dissertation came into it, were governance and sort of how it related to takeovers. And then LBOs became a really hot topic. Steve Kaplan's dissertation was a big thing. And then there was a big literature on the effect of internal capital markets and diversification. And there was a whole series of papers on why the Japanese keiretsu system was so good. And then in the early 90s, there was a big debate on the big bankruptcy conference. And so HBS had this big, there was a special issue JFE on bankruptcy. And there was an international debate on bankruptcy too, because there was people, Grossman Hart had a nice paper on how to structure an optimal bankruptcy code, and financial development and economic development was big, and then there was also papers on why the Japanese keiretsu system was so bad. The same people who wrote the paper on why it was so good a few years earlier. And so what was going on in the world at the time? Well, in the 80s there was a big takeover boom, right? For you guys, it's probably in the history books. The rest of us up here, we go through it, and it was really quite exciting. There was now one of the reasons why we concluded there was a takeover boom was that a lot of them were motivated by mismanagement in the corporation. So that led to the discussion of governance, and then the internal capital markets came out of the notion that there were all these bust-up takeovers, and why are there bust-up takeovers, and so somehow they must be inefficient, right? And then there was a Japanese stock market. There was a huge stock market run-up. You guys know the famous story about there's a French and Viterbo paper that you probably read. It's called "Were Japanese Stock Markets Too High?" But the original working paper version was "Are Japanese stock prices too high?" And it was written before the Japanese market crashed. Then in the early 90s, there was a big debate. There was a recession in the early 90s, and there was a lot of bankrupt LBOs. And then that led to a lot of research on bankruptcy. Internationally, there was the end of the Cold War ended. Many countries were sort of starting from scratch, and they were thinking about how to design their bankruptcy codes, and so that led to research on how to structure the bankruptcy system. The Japanese stock market was crashing, and so everyone was trying to figure out why. And so that's kind of, I mean, there's a clear linkage there. So if you go on later on, so if you start to the mid to late 90s, there was a boom in entrepreneurial finance and venture capital. There was a whole lot of papers. The Lugren and Ritter papers came out about IPOs. Behavioral finance got applied to corporate finance, and Malcolm Baker and Jeff Wergler had some big papers in there. Then law and finance was a huge thing that happened in the late 90s. Then after 2000, there was a huge, a bit of a run-up in corporate governance and executive compensation. Private equity became a big topic I started getting interested in about then. And international corporate finances. And I actually put that down. Raising capital internationally and cross-listings was kind of a pretty big topic at the time. And in recent years, anything to do with the financial crisis has been really, really hot. Well, what was going on in the world? Again, there was an internet bubble that spurred the interest in entrepreneurial finance and venture capital. There were tons of IPOs in the 90s. You probably don't remember that because we don't have many of them today, but there used to be many more than there are now. The stock market appeared to lots of people to be overvalued in the 90s, and so that led to questions as to why it was overvalued. And again, law and finance, there was a whole issue of how to improve economic development and how to structure legal systems. And so after 2000, well, there was an end round in WorldCom, and that led to a lot of literature on the new Sarbanes-Oxley, and then that led to a lot of literature on governance. There was a big LBO boom that sort of ended in 2007. Although as Andrew talked about, the financial markets became much more globalized, and that led to a boom in international corporate finance literature. And the financial crisis, of course, has led to Viral, and many other people have written a lot on, Morello has written a lot on international. So what do we take away from all of this, okay? What's next? And I have no idea what's going to go on in the world, and I actually heard on some of my BlackBerry, the Senate reached a deal, so maybe there won't be a default in the U.S. Economy, but who knows what the next crisis will be, right? I think the way you should think about picking topics is there's some fundamental things that are changing about the world that will lead to the way that corporate finance is practiced, and that's likely to lead to kind of fruitful research ideas. And so I think a sensible research strategy on your part going forward is to sort of try and understand the implications of this for the world and for the financial world. And so what I just did was I kind of just started typing potential research topics with kind of a bias towards things that I'm interested in and I've worked on. So here it goes. So I think that one of the things that's going on is debt is becoming much more complicated, and understanding debt structures is important. So one of the things that's changed in the last few years is that debt can be easily packaged and structured and sold. And how does that affect the corporate finance, and how does it affect its use? Does the optimal capital structure change? I don't think we know the answer to that question. What's the ownership structure of debt? Who should own the debt? And does this actually matter? How does the fact that the debt can be sold affect reorganizations in bankruptcy? And certainly a lot of the work that Martin was getting at about hedge funds and reorganizations sort of gets at this. And what do actual capital structures look like? And there's a paper that we published by Josh Rao and Amr Sufi in the RFS that sort of looks at that, and I have a paper with Tim Jenkins and Wolf Axelson and Per Stromberg that looks at sort of the capital structures of LBOs in a similar way. Globalization, I'll make my slide up off. How does the increasingly global nature of financial markets affect the capital raising process? Do multinationals have an advantage being able to access markets in other countries? And we had a dissertation at Ohio State by Li-Jin Zhang, who's now at Purdue, who sort of looked at this question. What's optimal ownership structure across countries? In other words, should a multinational be owned by the developing country, or by the developed country? Should it be owned home or away? And what's the optimal pattern of cross-border M&A? I saw there was actually a cross-border M&A paper or two in your dissertations, and Andrew mentioned one. I wrote one with Ishil Rao and Rose Lau. And at the end of the day, who should own the company's assets? Should the assets be in developing economy owned locally or by agents of development? I mean, it seems like the kinds of things that are likely to not have legs, and kind of, these are fundamental questions that are not going to be kind of, well, what's the tax reform of 2013 going to look like, which will be out of date in a few years. And how does a global, there's regulatory issues, right? So how does the fact that there's a global economy affect optimal regulation in any one country? Another thing about that I think is changing a lot is the development of capital markets through engineering and innovation. How does innovation in the form of new securities affect? I can send you these slides if anyone wants them. Affects the fact that the new securities and old securities are much more liquid, affect their usage by firms. I mean, I don't know if it does or not, but it seems like that's a question you could ask. How does one design an optimal capital structure with an infinite number of possible securities? And what's the role of new securities in liquidity management? And I had to, since Marilla's in charge, I had to cite one of his papers that he and I just wrote, about liquidity management. We don't really talk about new securities very much in our new survey paper we wrote, but maybe we should have. So I think that there's new ways that firms can do that. Alternative assets is another interesting area that Martin talked about in his little talk. So it seems to me that there's a big shift in the allocation of assets towards other what are called alternative assets, which could be hedge funds and private equity firms. And if you look at the in big endowments, they are just increasing their proportion dramatically, and that has, I think, real implications. And so, what is the performance has been, and moreover, how is it going to affect the fact that there's all this new money going into the alternative assets, going to affect their structure and their performance in the future? And I think that's a real question that not only us, but people in the real world are really interested in, because there's a lot of endowment managers who come up to you at conferences and they'll say, well, I don't know, should I invest in private equity or not? And so now it went from being this tiny little industry that was a startup to basically this mature industry that all MBA students want to work at, that has billions and billions and billions of dollars under capital under management. How many more companies can be bought out? I mean, and how many value? I mean, and that seems like a big question. And I have a paper with Berg, Sensoy, and Yuan on this topic. And to what extent? I mean, this is something that Martin got at in his talk. That to what extent are these likely to be a sense of operational improvement? So anyway, that's sort of some random topics. I didn't touch on some of my favorite topics, but there's tons of stuff to work on in the next few years. The second topic I wanted to talk about, though, is the journal process. And I was RFS editor for 7.5 years, and so I thought it was a great thing. And it just by coincidence, it turns out that Itay and Andrew and David are all here, and they're the new editors, or some of them. And I just kind of, one of the things that we like to do as editors is to sort of be as transparent as possible. Obviously, we can't tell you the names of your referees or anything like that, but I think you should know the process that the papers go through, and you guys should interrupt me if I get anything wrong, or you do it different.
We promise.
What?
We promise.
Okay. So basically, what happens is the first thing that happens is you submit a paper, and it's all done online nowadays. All the journals do it. By the way, this is the RFS thing. The JF and the JFE and other journals have slightly different processes, but it's basically the same. Jacqueline is the assistant there. She looks it over. We actually have rules on how big the font is, because there were people who would submit 60 or 70-page papers in 10-point with single space, and referees would scream at us, and we would not be able to use it.
So who are those people?
I can't tell you their names. So we actually have a postdoc, and if some of you may actually be interested in applying for this position. I'm not sure whether the guy who's doing it this year will be coming back next year, but he does an excellent job. He suggests 3 or 4 referees, and often what happens is that he'll recommend, some of them he'll recommend desk projection for various reasons, and one of the reasons might be that if it's a paper that's obviously written for practitioners and not for academics, or if it's a paper that's obviously horrible, or there's just maybe something that's clearly not an incremental contribution that's large enough. And then David Hirschleifer suggests an editor. Basically, he assigns it to one of us, and not me anymore, but one of these guys. And one of his innovations is he takes requests, but he doesn't always honor your requests, so that if you have a complicated theory paper, and Itay's probably going to get it more than Dave, no matter who you request. But there's also constraints, and if Dave's got 12 papers in the last 2 weeks, David Hirschleifer probably won't want to assign it to him. And the other thing that they do at RFS, which I think is great, is that the editor who handles your paper has total control. Like David Hirschleifer likes to put his 2 cents in and helps the authors a little bit, but he never overrules a decision that the editor makes. And so other journals don't work that way. So like the QJE or JP, I think they have to have 2 editors sign off on the paper, and it's much more burdensome, I think, on the authors. And so the paper's been assigned to me. What did I do? So the first thing I did was to read the paper quickly and get a sense of the main idea of it. And one of the nice things about the RFS was that we all got papers in our area. So Dave Dennis probably gets all the corporate finance papers that I used to get. And there's so many corporate finance papers that sort of your whole quota is probably corporate finance, whereas Andrew might get a few corporate finance papers, and Ite gets, so it kind of works out that way reasonably well. And then I would look at the suggested referees that the postdocs suggested. And often, they're usually very good suggestions, and they're often people who you haven't spoken to for 3 or 4 years, but when you think about it, oh yeah, he would be a perfect person, and then you end up using him. And then in general, they do a good job. One of the things that I can't speak for these guys, but I tended to use people that I knew rather than people who I didn't know personally, just because they're more likely to do the report, they're more likely to do a good job, and you also kind of you know their personality. So some people are just kind of a little bit difficult, and if they say a paper is pretty good, that means some other people might think it's great, and other people think everything's great. So you have to sort of adjust a little bit for the biases there. And then the other question I always got was, how come you use 1 referee or 2 referees? And I can't speak for these guys. David Hirschleifer and Matt Spiegel always would give us total discretion over the number of referees that we would use. But what I would do, my rule was you would always use 1 unless there was a reason to use more. But there are often good reasons to use more. So that some of the reasons I would get is sometimes there's a potential conflict. So that, if there's a paper that's critical of somebody else's paper, I want to know what the guy who's being criticized thinks, right? I think that's a fair, if your paper is being published and somebody writes a paper criticizing it, you may think there's something terribly wrong with the criticism, and you should have the right to voice that opinion. On the other hand, that shouldn't be the only opinion, and so that you want to have a more neutral person to sort of handle the dispute. Sometimes the best person is a very senior person who they get very busy and they'll write 3 sentences or a paragraph or 2. And so you'd want a more detailed report to give help to the author if you want to publish it. Sometimes I actually just, when I'm running around the country giving seminars, I meet somebody who's working on an area on a paper I'm handling, I'll let them write a second report, or if there's a PhD student who's working on a related area to a paper, I'll have them write a second report. And sometimes there's multiple issues with the paper. So I just had a very good paper where the referee, very good referee, said, this is a great paper, except it's using structural estimation. I don't do structural estimation, so please have somebody who does structural estimation check it out and make sure the estimation's okay, because I don't want to sign off and have it published if there might be. And it turned out that their structural person said it was a great estimation as well, so we're going to publish the paper. But that's the kind of reason why I would want to use multiple, or more commonly there would be like a theory section, and you'd want somebody who actually can understand the theory, and then an empirical section, so you might have 2 referees for that. And that's the way I did it. Each of these guys probably does it a little bit differently. What I do is I get the report back from the referee, I read the letter, I read the report. If the referee hates the paper, I just usually rejected it pretty quickly. The referee on the fence, I would read the paper myself, but sometimes I would try a second referee. So that would be another reason to try a second referee. If the referee likes the paper and thinks it might be publishable, that's when I spend the most time on the paper. And we were talking at dinner last night. Sometimes a paper can take a whole day or 2 days or something of just the editor's time, because you really want to make sure it's as good as possible before it gets published. And sometimes, one of the things that we do sometimes is overrule referees, and sometimes, and if we don't think the referee did a good report, or if the other referee disagrees, you have to pick one and use your own judgment, and that's why the editors did check. So, one of the things I did when I was editor, and I guess I could say this now, is I almost never asked for a revision unless I thought the paper would ultimately be published. I can't even think of any papers that I rejected on the second or third round. I just hate that when I'm an author. So I would rather, my rule is I would rather reject it on the first round, even if it's like perfectly fine but a little boring or something. I didn't think it would ultimately make it. I would rather reject it on the first round than have an author go to another journal rather than to go through a couple rounds and waste a year of their time and then ultimately reject it. So I kind of didn't do that. And most of the time when you send a paper back to the authors, they're very good about responding to your points, and so that wasn't really an issue. So there was an appeal process, and this is something that actually people don't quite understand, so I want to explain this. Matt Spiegel started it, it seemed to work well. Rejections do get overturned. There is no stigma for appealing. If you appeal every single paper you get rejected, there might be, but that's never happened. People say, I don't want to appeal because it was in the bad signal. That doesn't mean it. There's no bad signal, there's no nothing. I mean, basically the way it would work is, you would appeal. The journal wants, it's in the journal's interest to publish the best papers possible. So if the referee's made a mistake, we want to know about it so that we can publish a good paper. It's not like it's a pain in the neck. It's something that's designed from the journal's perspective to get the best papers in the journal. So the way it works, and we went to cocktails last year, so we all had a slightly different way of doing this. But the way that I did it is that I would give all the information, including the reports, the letters from the authors' referees, minus the referees' identities, to what's called an omnibus referee. So that, and the omnibus referee would be somebody who gets to remain anonymous, but actually makes the decision. So that I will say that, as omnibus referees, I've used people sitting up here before, and so that's the kind of person you would ask, and then I would say, okay, what should I do? And usually the answer was, send it to a second referee, and I'd say, who, and they would give me a name, and unless there was some conflict, or if another editor had just given that person a paper referee, I probably wouldn't use that name, but otherwise I probably would. And then it tells me, and so I would send a form letter to the person. The idea is that they would not realize it's an appeal. Now, sometimes they probably can figure it out. So, like, I just sent a form letter on a sort of quote-unquote new submission to a referee, 4 months after I was stepped down as editor. So he probably figured out that there was something that wasn't really a new submission, but I don't know if he did. But most of the time, I think they think it's a new submission. And when it gets back to me, I send all the stuff to the omnibus referee and basically say, what do I do? And write a paragraph or two explaining to the authors, and they've been great about doing that. So that's the way the RFS has done the appeal process. And so if your job market paper gets rejected and you really think the referee messed up, you shouldn't feel bad about appealing it. Now, just one last thing I will say, and no one take the process seriously. And so that one of the things that drives editors crazy is when people sort of adopt what I call a shotgun approach to submissions, where you send in, the way a shotgun it has a whole range of bullets, and you don't care which one hits the target so long as one of them does. And some people send in 10 papers just figuring if 1 or 2 gets in, then that's good, right? And that drives your editors crazy, and that will give you a bad reputation. No one can write 10 good papers a year, not even Gene Fum. I wrote that before he wrote it over. Maybe that's not true anymore. A ton of papers in the top journals. And the other thing is you should realize that if your paper's rejected, a lot of people say they didn't take me seriously. I think the answer is they probably did take your paper seriously. And unfortunately, most papers get rejected. And I think that, and not always. I can't. There are bad referees, but most of the time, you did have a fair shot at getting in. But most papers at a top journal just kind of don't have the scope. Most papers that are rejected are not incorrect, but they don't have the scope that we want to get. So like these guys now, they're the editors of the RFS. What they want to do is they want to compete with the JF and the JFE, and they want to get just not good correct papers, but they want to get the most influential papers in the RFS and let the JFE have the sort of correct but boring ones. And of course, Bill Schwartz would say the same thing, and Ken Singleton would say the same thing. And so therefore, there's sort of a competitive process to get not just right papers, but really the most influential papers. And so that if your paper is rejected, probably it just means that the editor didn't think it had a chance of being as influential as the ones that he accepted. And the other thing that you should always do is to take the comments of every referee report seriously, even if it's a rejection, for a bunch of reasons. The first reason is that, you know, often if you send your paper to another journal, well, that editor is going to not know that the referee rejected it from the RFS, but they're going to go through the same thought process about who should be the right referee, and they'll often come to the same conclusion. So that if Murillo rejects a paper for me, and then 6 months later Bill Schwartz sends it to him, and not a word has been changed, he's not going to be very happy. He's going to write a letter to Bill Schwartz saying, these idiots, they just kind of, you know, I spent 2 days of my life writing this report with detailed comments, which these authors chose to ignore. And that doesn't send a good signal. But moreover, the referee's comments sort of tell you what's wrong with your paper. Maybe it might just be the way you wrote it. It might be that you kind of didn't think that you did some specification tests that you didn't think were all that important, but the referee really did think they're important. Or a dozen other things. You know, the way you wrote it up, the emphasis of the paper, maybe you should be using international data. Maybe you should do a lot of things. And so that I think you should really try and take all the referee reports seriously, even on rejections, and then ultimately, there's actually an editorial that the editors have written in all three of the top journals recently, basically saying the same point. And so that people don't like the process. If you go to the bar late at night, you will find people complaining about the journals at any major conference. But it is the process that it is, and you have to live with it if you're going to be an academic. And more importantly, I think that it's true that the editor, I'm no longer an editor, so I can speak for these guys, that they try very seriously and very hard to make the process as fair as possible, but also to get the very best papers in their journals. And so that's kind of how it works. And so you kind of have to understand it if you're going to play the journal. That's all I have to say. So.
Any burning questions? Reading.